A scream cuts through the night. It is brief, smothered almost as soon as it is born, but it shudders along the veins of Seville like a tremor through bone. A dog barks, then falls silent. A drunkard pauses in the street, peers into the alley, and tells himself it was nothing. By morning he will have forgotten, or convinced himself he imagined it, for this city, this labyrinth of shadows and saints, has always swallowed its screams whole. A candle burns in a room no larger than a crypt. Its flame flickers with each draught, illuminating the tools of barber laid neatly in their place. Scissors, comb, brushes, a razor. The blade is honed so fine it could split a hair, but tonight it has split something else. Its edge glitters red as it catches the light. The chair stands in the centre of the room, as it always does. Worn smooth by years of use, the arms polished by the nervous hands of strangers, it gleams like an idol, an altar upon which men offer their throats. But tonight, the chair does not creak with waiting. Its cushion is damp, and at its feet a dark stain creeps across the floorboards, inching toward the open cellar door. The barber hums softly to himself, stropping the razor with mechanical devotion. A lullaby, perhaps, or the chant of a priest at his devotions. His face is serene, almost kind. The sort of face a weary sailor might trust after weeks at sea. The sort a merchant might relax before. The sort a pilgrim might see as a promise of comfort. But kindness is only the mask. Beneath it something hungrier breathes. He bends, seizes the limp weight at his feet, and drags it toward the darkness yawning beneath the floorboards. The cellar swallows it whole, the sound muffled by earth and stone. When he returns, he wipes the chair clean with methodical precision, humming all the while. The candle sputters, the blade gleams once more. The chair waits. Outside, Seville slumbers uneasily. The year is the late 18th century. By day, the city dazzles with sunlight spilling over tiled roofs and the golden spire of the Giralda. Merchants from the New World crowd the port, their ships groaning with silver and spices. Priests in black cassocks glide through the squares, while beggars crouch in the shade of the cathedral, their bowls rattling with coins. The air is alive with music, with prayer, with the shuffle of countless feet. But by night, Seville changes. The light bleeds out of its whitewashed alleys. The labyrinth becomes a trap, and in that darkness, rumours breed. Men vanish, not respectable men with families and wealth. No, their absence would stir the authorities. The missing are strangers, transients, sailors fresh off the ships, pilgrims without kin. They disappear quietly like smoke through a grate. Neighbours shrug. Perhaps he went to Cadiz. Perhaps he drowned in drink. Perhaps he never existed at all. But in the taverns, when the wine flows, tongues loosen. They say there is a barber, someone whispers, eyes darting. A barber, another scoffs. Yes, a barber who kills his clients, slits their throats mid-shave, takes their purses. And the bodies? Gone, as if devoured by the earth. A third voice, low and trembling. Not the earth. The oven. Have you smelled the pies from the shop next door? Sweet, savoury, but strange. Too strange. Listeners laugh, half in jest, half in dread. Yet when the laughter dies, silence presses in. For though the tale reeks of absurdity, each man recalls someone who vanished without trace. And when he next passes that barber's door, he quickens his pace, eyes fixed firmly on the ground. This is the legend that festers in Seville's heart. The tale of the demon barber. El Barbero Asesino. El Demonio con la Navaja. A man who turned trust into a weapon, who transformed his trade into a slaughterhouse, who perhaps conspired with a baker to feed the city its own flesh. It is a story that unsettles because it preys on intimacy. A barber's shop is no fortress, no battlefield. It is a place of disarming vulnerability. To sit in that chair is to bare one's throat, to surrender sight and sound, to place one's life in another's hands for the sake of vanity. And what is the razor but the perfect assassin's tool? Thin, quick, silent. A cut so clean it is almost a caress. Picture it. A weary traveller enters the shop, dust on his boots, coins jingling in his pouch. The barber greets him with a smile, gestures to the chair. The man relaxes, sinking into its embrace. Warm water steams, soap foams, the razor hovers. For a moment he is lulled into calm, comforted by the ritual, and then, one swift stroke, red blooms across linen. A sigh gurgles, silence. The barber hums, the chair waits for the next. And what of the baker? A woman, the legend claim, whose oven burned long into the night, its smoke curling into the alleys. Neighbours remember the scent. Meat pies, rich and savoury, their crusts golden. Strange meat, they murmured, but delicious. Only later did suspicion curdle into horror. For where else, they asked, could the barber's victims have gone? Flesh does not vanish. It is consumed. Truth and rumour blur, as they always do. Perhaps there was no barber, no baker. Perhaps it was all a tale spun from hunger and fear, a Gothic echo of older European legends. For in France, in Italy, in England, whispers of murderous barbers and cannibal bakers surfaced long before Seville's. Yet here, in the twisting alleys beneath the Giralda's shadow, the story took root, grew teeth, and refused to die. The candle burns low, the cellar yawns dark, the razor gleams in the half-light. And so we stand at the threshold of nightmare, unsure whether we face history or folklore. Did Seville truly harbour such a monster, or has the city carried a phantom in its memory, a cautionary tale dressed in blood? The scream is gone, the streets are silent, the chair waits, the question remains. Would you trust the man holding the blade? The city wakes beneath a bruised sky. Dawn slides its pale hand over the rooftops of Seville, gilding tiled domes and balconies with a light too weak to chase away the shadows. Bells toll from the Giralda, their iron throats ringing across the river, summoning the faithful to prayer. Yet beneath the piety, Seville stirs with hungers far more earthly. This is the late 18th century, an age when the city still licks the wounds of decline. Once, Seville had been the jewel of Spain, the crown port of empire, the place where galleons from the New World disgorged their silver, sugar and slaves. Gold had flowed like water, gilding altars and raising palaces. But fortunes rot as quickly as fruit in the sun. Disease, corruption and shifting trade routes had bled Seville dry, diverting wealth to Cadiz. By the century's end, the city was both magnificent and desperate, a lady in brocade, her gown moth-eaten beneath the jewels. The streets tell the truth better than the churches. Step into them and you find the clash of opposites, splendour and squalor pressed so close they nearly kiss. In one square, merchants in silks haggle over spices and tobacco. In the next, beggars claw through refuse for scraps of bread. Sailors stagger from taverns with pockets heavy 1 hour and empty the next. Children chase rats through alleyways while the noblemen rattle past in carriages, wheels splashing mud onto barefoot pilgrims. The architecture itself becomes a metaphor for contradiction. Whitewashed walls conceal crumbling interiors. Courtyards bloom with jasmine, even as cesspools fester nearby. The city's labyrinth of alleys is beautiful from above, like a tangle of lace. From within, it suffocates. Narrow corridors twist upon themselves, leading into dead ends, blind corners, and cul-de-sacs where lamplight dies. Here the devout kneel in prayer at shrines to the Virgin, while only steps away, cut-purses and whores ply their trades in the shadows. It is in these very shadows that the whispers of the demon barber find fertile soil, for Seville is a city that knows hunger. Bread riots erupt when harvests fail and famine lurks like a wolf at the edge of every winter. Crime is both survival and profession. Knives glint beneath cloaks, the night watch is too few, too poorly paid to keep order. In the taverns along the Arenal, drunken sailors boast of fortunes earned, only to vanish before dawn. Their absence raises little alarm. Strangers are transient by nature, and a missing man might as easily have taken ship as met his end in a dark alley. The Inquisition still breathes, though weaker than in its heyday. Fear of heresy seeps through the cobblestones, shaping rumour into parable. Every strange disappearance becomes a moral tale, every unexplained horror a sign of sin. Cannibalism in particular is whispered with shudders, an echo of famine years when starving families had been accused of unholy feasts, whether true or not. To devour human flesh was to renounce God, to become beast, demon, devil. What greater terror than to consume sin unknowingly, to swallow damnation with one's supper? Thus the tale of the barber and the baker finds its stage, a city where hunger meets superstition, where desperation feeds invention, where crime blends so easily with myth that the two are indistinguishable. Walk with me through Seville, and you will see how such a legend could take root. In the marketplace, vendors cry their wares, fresh figs, salted cod, loaves steaming from the oven. The air is thick with cumin and oranges, sweet wine and sewage. A beggar drags himself between stalls, his legs withered, his hand outstretched. No one meets his gaze. Across the square, a woman sells empanadas, their crusts golden, their scent irresistible. "Caliente, recién hecho," she calls, thrusting them towards the passing sailors. They laugh, bite and chew, grease dripping down their beards. The pies taste of meat, though which meat, none can quite say. A few streets away, in the arenal, taverns roar with music. Guitars strum, voices rise, dice clatter across wooden tables. Sailors gamble their wages, whores beckon from doorways, and thieves circle like wolves. Here a man may vanish without witness. A knife between the ribs, a shove into the river, and the city forgets him by morning. It is in these same taverns that the whispers of the barber grow louder, traded between cups of sour wine. "Beware the shop on Calle del Hombre de Piedra," someone mutters. That's where they go in, but never out. Laughter follows, but nervous laughter, the kind that hides belief. The barber himself, if he existed, was never named in the early tales. He was not a man, but a figure, faceless, nameless, a mask anyone might wear, and that was the true terror. For in Seville, barbers were everywhere, their red and white poles twisted above countless doors, marking places where men gathered not only to shave but to gossip, to bleed, to be healed. The barber was confidant, physician, servant and friend. To suggest one might be a murderer was to accuse the very fabric of society. And yet how easy the thought became once planted. The barber's shop, small, private, intimate, was the perfect trap. A place where a man is most vulnerable, his eyes closed, his throat bare. Who would hear his cry? Who would know his fate? In a city where death was common, a single missing man was a ripple in a river, already red with blood. Night falls again, and Seville holds its breath. Oil lamps gutter in the alleys, their light devoured by walls leaning too close. Somewhere a lute plays, sweet and to melancholy. Somewhere else a knife slides from its sheath. A man stumbles home drunk, unaware of footsteps behind him. And in a small shop a chair waits empty, its wood gleaming, its cushion damp. This is the Seville in which the demon barber's legend was born. A city of saints and sinners, gilded altars and festering gutters. A city where hunger gnawed at bellies, fear haunted prayers, and beauty masked corruption so deep it could swallow men whole. And into this darkness stepped the barber with the razor, the man who was said to carve his living from the throats of strangers. Whether real or invented, he was the perfect child of his city, half shadow, half substance, wholly terrifying. The streets echo with whispers. Tomorrow another man may vanish. Tomorrow another pie may be sold, steaming hot from the oven. And the city, as always, will look away. For Seville is not only a place of light and prayer, it is a city of shadows, and in shadows monsters are born. The chair waits, not the chair of a nobleman, nor the throne of a king, but a simple wooden frame polished by the weight of countless men. Yet here, within these arms, throats are bared and lives are trusted to another's hand. The barber's shop is no palace, no cathedral, but in the late 18th century it is a sanctuary of a different kind. Barbers are everywhere in Seville. Their red and white poles twist above doorways, marking thresholds where men step in weary and emerge transformed. They are not merely haircutters. They are surgeons, dentists, bloodletters, surgeons of the poor. In a city where physicians are costly and priests are concerned with souls rather than bodies, the barber becomes both healer and confidant. Step into his shop and you will hear the music of blades, razors are stropped against leather, scissors clicking like insect wings, water poured steaming into bowls. The air smells of soap, sharp, medicinal, faintly sweet. A man sits, sighs as warm lather spreads across his cheeks, closes his eyes as steel hovers close. Here intimacy reigns. Few trades bring men so near to death and trust at once. For the barber's tools are double-edged, both benign and deadly. A razor, finely honed, can sculpt a face into refinement or open a throat in an instant. The lancet, meant for bloodletting, can just as easily bleed a man dry. The forceps that pull a tooth may also pull a scream, and all of this happens in silence, behind doors closed against the street. It is this very intimacy that makes the barber's trade the perfect cloak for darker appetites. Who would suspect? A man sits, relaxed, lulled by ritual. The barber hums, his hand steady, his touch almost tender. A cut is expected, indeed necessary, for what is shaving but the art of drawing a blade across vulnerable flesh? That a stroke might slip deeper than intended is always possible. That it might slip intentionally is the stuff of nightmare. And in Seville, nightmare and reality blur easily. The barber is both servant and master. The poor come to him for healing when no doctor will see them. The rich come to him for grooming, placing their faces, their throats, their very veins in his hands. He learns their secrets, overhears their gossip, sees them in moments of weakness. A confession whispered in jest might be repeated. A purse too heavy might prove temptation. Trust is his greatest commodity and the greatest trap. Legends across Europe had long toyed with this fear. In Paris, tales circulated of barbers who slit travellers' throats, their accomplices butchers who sold the flesh as meat. In Italy, whispers spoke of similar crimes, though no evidence endured. These were cautionary stories, fables dressed in blood, serving as warnings against strangers and indulgence. But in Seville, the tale rooted itself deeply, perhaps because the barber's role was so close to both sanctity and sin. Picture the scene as the city imagined it. A sailor enters the shop, his beard goosebump grown thick after weeks at sea. He drops a coin on the counter, grateful for the relief of a proper shave. The barber smiles, gestures to the chair. Steam rises as water is poured. Soap froths, lather spreads. The sailor sighs, lulled into the trust. The barber strops his razor slowly, the sound like a whisper of steel on skin. The sailor closes his eyes. Then, one swift stroke. A sigh cut short, blood blooming across the apron. The sailor's eyes snap open, then dim forever. His body slumps, dragged toward the cellar. The chair is wiped, the razor cleaned, the shop reset for the next. The barber himself, in the legend, was not described as monstrous. He was ordinary, perhaps handsome, perhaps plain but never grotesque. That was the point. Evil hides best in the familiar. A snarling demon is easy to avoid, a smiling barber is not. His very normalcy was his mask. And what of the baker, said to be his accomplice? She too was ordinary in recollection. A woman whose oven burned long, whose pastries were sold cheap, whose pies drew sailors and beggars alike. In a city gnawed by hunger, few asked questions of cheap meat. Hunger swallows doubt. But in hindsight, neighbours claimed to recall strange flavours, odd textures, pies too rich for pork alone. Memory, of course, is a liar, reshaping itself to fit the horror once named. Whether true or not, the pairing of barber and baker carries a grim poetry. One cuts, one cooks, one takes life, the other transforms it into sustenance. Together, they mock the sacred, turning the act of sharing food into an act of consuming sin. In a Catholic city, where bread was the body of Christ, what blasphemy could be greater than bread filled with human flesh? The church did not invent this story, but it surely embraced its lessons. The barber's razor became a symbol of temptation, how easily trust can turn to death. The baker's oven became a warning against gluttony, against consuming too greedily, without asking what lies beneath the crust. The tale became sermon as much as scandal, a parable dressed in gore, yet not all were convinced. Skeptics pointed out the lack of records, the absence of names. Seville kept meticulous archives of trials, executions, punishments. Nowhere, they argued, does a barber and baker duo appear. The tale, they insisted, was a shadow imported from France, from Italy, from London itself, merely draped in local costume. But to those who whispered in taverns, who swore they smelled strange meat in the pies, who recalled friends who vanished into alleys and never returned, the truth mattered little. The legend was true because it felt true, in a city where men disappeared every week. Was it so hard to imagine a barber's chair as the final place they sat? The barber's trade, trusted, intimate, necessary, was both the shield and the sword of the story. His tools were innocent, yet deadly. His role was essential, yet vulnerable. His shop was ordinary, yet perfectly designed for murder. And in this paradox, the legend sharpened itself like a razor, ready to cut through fact and fiction alike. Night falls again in Seville. The lamps gutter, the streets empty, the river whispers. In the small shop the chair waits once more. gleaming faintly in the candlelight. A razor lies on the counter, its edge honed to perfection. The barber hums softly, stropping the blade with the patience of ritual. Outside, footsteps approach. A man hesitates at the threshold, weary from travel, eager for relief. He does not know the whispers, or perhaps he does and dismisses them as drunken tales. He sees only a smiling barber, a clean chair, the promise of comfort. He steps inside. The door closes. The city holds its breath. It begins, as all dark tales do, with a murmur. A sailor is missing. Nothing unusual in that. Men vanish in Seville as easily as smoke vanishes into the cathedral rafters. Some drown drunk in the river, some are knifed in alleys, some desert their ships. But this sailor was last seen alive, stepping into a barber's shop on a crooked street. His comrades remember it clearly. He had laughed, patted the purse at his belt and said he would return shaved, refreshed, ready for drink. He never returned. Days passed, and the barber shop door remained closed, its shutters drawn. No one dares speak it aloud, but the thought takes root. Perhaps he is still inside. Then another man disappears, and another. Always the same pattern. Strangers, sailors, transients. Men with coin to spend and no family to question when they fail to reappear. Their absence would not have stirred the city at all, were it not for the strange coincidences whispered by neighbours. There are smells, they say. Strange smells drifting from the bakery next door. Not unpleasant, on the contrary, savoury, rich, mouth-watering. But somehow uncanny, too heavy, too pungent. "Have you tasted her pies?" a woman mutters in the marketplace. "Too rich for pork, too strange for lamb, I tell you, it is something else she bakes." Laughter follows, nervous and brittle, but behind the laughter eyes dart toward the shuttered barber's shop and men cross themselves. The gossip spreads through taverns, where wine loosens tongues and the line between jest and truth blurs. They say the barber slits his customers' throats, one sailor mutters, drops the bodies through a trapdoor. "And then what?" another asks, leaning close. "Then the baker makes pies of them." The table erupts in drunken laughter. But later, when the sailors stumble out into the night, they glance uneasily toward the alleys. They do not walk past the barber's door. By the time the story reaches the far side of the city, it has grown teeth. Some say the barber sings while he kills, humming hymns like a priest of death. Others swear the baker's oven burns hotter than any other, never going out, fueled by flesh as well as wood. A child swears she saw a man's hand in the gutter behind the shop, gnawed clean of flesh. A beggar insists he tasted something in a pie that was too much like us. Seville shudders, caught between disbelief and dread. The rational scoff. Why would anyone commit such crimes in the heart of the city? Where are the bodies, the blood, the proof? But the poor know better. Proof is unnecessary. The city already smells of corruption. Why should its ovens not reek of it too? And besides, this is not the first tale of its kind. In Paris there had been whispers of barbers and bakers who preyed on travellers, their crimes discovered only when bones clogged the drains. In Florence, rumours had swirled of butchers who sold human flesh as pork during famine years. And in London, though still decades away from its full flowering, stories had already begun to circulate of a barber in Fleet Street who murdered his clients and whose accomplice baked their remains into pies. The stories shift with geography, but their bones remain the same. A trusted trade turned predatory, a tool of comfort transformed into a weapon, and the ultimate blasphemy, neighbours consuming their own kind without knowing it. Why does such a legend persist? Hunger is part of it. In times of famine, people feared not only starvation but betrayal. What if the food that sustained them was itself damnation? Religion adds its weight. The body and blood of Christ were consumed at every Mass. What darker inversion could there be than consuming the body and blood of one's fellow man in a tavern or bakery? But perhaps most of all the legend endures because it cuts to the heart of trust. A barber's shop is a place of vulnerability, a bakery a place of nourishment. To twist these oases into sites of murder and cannibalism is to suggest that nowhere is safe, not even the most ordinary corners of daily life. In Seville, the tale takes on a distinctly local flavour. The barber is nameless, faceless, a shadow who could be any man behind any pole-striped door. The baker, too, is ordinary, a woman whose pies once seemed generous, now sinister. Their very anonymity makes them more terrifying, for if they had faces, they could be avoided. Without faces, they are everywhere. The whispers grow so loud they echo even in daylight. Housewives shun the bakery, muttering prayers. Sailors spit on the cobblestones when passing the barber's door. Children dare one another to peer through the shutters, to see if bones lie piled within. The story becomes as real as the streets themselves. Yet still, no proof emerges. The barber does not confess, the baker does not flee, the authorities remain silent. And so the city hangs in a limbo of dread, where every pie is suspect, every razor stroke a threat. In time, the whispers cross borders, carried by travellers who repeat the tale in Cadiz, Madrid, Lisbon. Each retelling sharpens it, darkens it, dresses it in more gore. Some say the barber killed dozens, others claim hundreds. Some insist the baker served her pies at court, unwitting nobles praising their flavour while feasting on flesh. The legend grows, swelling like dough in the oven. But beneath the exaggeration, a question festers like rot. Did it happen here in Seville, or is the city merely a stage upon which Europe's oldest fears play once more? Night falls again. In the crooked alley, the barber's shutters remain closed. The bakery's chimney smokes, its scent drifting into the street. A passerby inhales, frowns, shakes at his head, and walks faster. Behind him, a child whispers to another, "They say if you eat the pies, you become like them, hungry forever, hungry for more." The other child laughs, but his eyes dart toward the oven, wide and afraid. The whispers do not die, they multiply, and with each retelling, the demon barber of Seville sharpens his razor anew. A city remembers its princes, its saints, its martyrs. It builds statues of generals, carves names of noblemen into stone. But of the poor, the transient, the forgotten, the city remembers nothing. They vanish not only from the streets, but from memory itself, erased as though they never drew breath. Seville in the 18th century was a city of arrivals and departures. Ships groaned into port from the Indies, their sails heavy with salt and wind. Sailors spilled onto the wharves with coins jingling in their pockets, laughter thick on their lips, hunger gnawing their bellies. Some came from Cadiz, some from Lisbon, some from land so far their names sounded foreign to civilian ears. They came with no kin, no roots, no witness to their existence beyond the purse they carried and the boots they wore thin on the cobblestones. Such men were easy to lose. The records of the city, where they exist at all, are filled with half-known. Notes. Un marinero inglés desaparecido. An English sailor missing. Un francés visto por última vez in la taberna. A Frenchman, last seen in the tavern. Rarely more than that. No family petitioned, no parish demanded inquiry, no friends insisted on search. The city shrugged, the sea swallowed, and the name, if it had ever been known, dissolved like smoke. And it was these men, the forgotten, whom the legend of the barber claimed as victims. The pattern emerges only in whispers, a litany of vanishings too quiet to rouse the law, yet too frequent to ignore. A Portuguese deckhand boasting of wages earned never seen again. A Castilian traveller carrying letters of credit last known to have stopped near the barber's shop. A boy barely 16, cabin hand on a merchant vessel, gone between shore and ship. Each case alone might be explained. Robbery, desertion, drunken folly. But together they form a shadow, a shape in the darkness too precise to dismiss. Neighbours spoke of men seen entering the barber's door, their heads bowed with fatigue, their steps eager for respite. None saw them emerge. The chair within the shop bore them, but the street never did again. And yet no hue or cry rose, for who mourns a stranger? Who risks angering neighbours, or the Inquisition, over a nameless sailor? Seville was a city where vanishing was common currency. Beggars died in doorways and were swept away by dawn. Prostitutes disappeared from the alleys without question. Orphans slipped into rivers, thieves into prisons, sick men into pits. Life was cheaper, death cheaper, memory cheapest of all. Still the whispers persisted. A merchant recalled hearing screams at night, though faint, muffled. A washerwoman swore she saw a man's boots outside the barber's door one evening, and by morning they were gone. A boy claimed he followed a drunkard into the shop, but when he dared peek inside later, the man was nowhere to be found. Was it imagination, or was it evidence? In a city where shadows bred like vermin, truth was hard to separate from fear. The men who vanished were those most vulnerable. Sailors were the lifeblood of Seville's port, yet they were treated as expendable. They spent recklessly, drank heavily, fought often. Many could not even write their names. When they disappeared, their captain shrugged and hired new hands. Pilgrims fared no better. They came seeking redemption, walking barefoot to cathedrals, clutching wooden crosses. Many were strangers, unmoored from family, their presence in the city fleeting. A pilgrim lost was simply one who had moved on. Even merchants, if they travelled alone, were easy prey. The streets were riddled with thieves, and a man vanishing with coin was assumed to have been robbed and discarded in the river. Few imagined his end might be in a barber's chair, a razor whispering across his throat. The legend grew bolder with each disappearance. Some whispered the barber kept a ledger of his victim, names scrawled in ink beside the amounts taken from their purses. Others swore the cellar beneath his shop was vast, lined with bones. A child insisted she saw a man drag through a trapdoor, his head lolling, his eyes glassy. No proof surfaced, but the fear itself became proof enough. And what of the bodies? Bodies are hard to hide, yet in this tale they vanished utterly. The explanation, whispered with shudders, was that they were not hidden at all, they were consumed. Their flesh, they said, was sold as food, their bones ground to dust, their very humanity devoured by neighbours too hungry to care. The baker's pies became the focus of suspicion. Men who once praised their richness now recoiled, swearing they tasted something too human. A story spread of a sailor who bit into a pie and spat it out, swearing the meat reminded him of something he could not name. He fell ill soon after, some said, haunted by what he had swallowed. Whether this story was true or not mattered little. The idea took root, and once planted, it could not be uneaten. The vanishing men thus became not only victims but nourishment, symbols of how the city consumed itself. They were forgotten in life, erased in death, and perhaps, horribly, ingested by their neighbours. In this way the legend reflected Seville itself, a city feeding on its poor, its transient, its disposable. Historians, centuries later, scoured the archives for evidence. They found missing men aplenty, records of sailors never returning, travellers lost without trace, but nothing directly tied to a murderous barber. No trial, no execution, no official decree. The silence is damning, but silence can lie as loudly as speech. For absence in the record may mean absence in fact, or it may mean the crime was so ordinary, so expected, that no one bothered to record it. What is a missing sailor to a city that loses sailors daily? What is one vanished beggar to a city where beggars rot in alleys? A crime committed against the forgotten is itself forgotten. And yet, the barber's legend remembers them. Each vanished face becomes a ghost seated forever in the chair, his throat eternally bare, his penance eternal. Each sailor swallowed by the cellar becomes another verse in the litany of fear. Their names may be lost, but their absence sings in whispers that outlast stone. At night, the city stirs uneasily. The taverns roar with song, but in the pauses between chords a silence creeps in. A drunkard stumbles home and pauses outside the barber's door. He swears he hears something, movement within, a muffled sound, perhaps a groan. He hurries on, telling himself that it was only imagination. Across the street, a woman closes her shutters tight, muttering a prayer. A child presses her ear to her pillow, listening for screams she half believes are real. The barber's shop stands silent, its shutters drawn, its chair waiting. The vanishing men are never seen again, but their presence lingers like smoke. In their silence the legend grows teeth, and so Seville becomes a stage of absence, a city where the forgotten feed the fears of the living. The men who vanish are not remembered in stone or story, except as ghosts, sharpened into myth by a razor in the dark. The chair waits, the razor gleams, the cellar yawns, another man is missing. And the city once again looks away. The chair waits in silence, its wood gleaming like bone in the candlelight. It is a simple thing, 4 legs, a seat, arms worn smooth by countless hands, but in legend it becomes an altar, a place where the ritual of murder is performed with the precision of liturgy. The barber presides like a priest, his tools his sacraments, his blade the chalice. To sit in the chair is to offer up one's throat in trust. To rise from it in this tale is to be reborn into silence. Picture the scene as Seville imagined it. A sailor stumbles in from the tavern, laughter still wet on his lips, coin heavy in his pouch. The barber greets him warmly, bids him sit. The air smells faintly of soap and singed oil, the scent of hot bread drifting from the bakery next door. The sailor eases himself into the chair, sighs as his weight sinks into its embrace. The barber hums softly, perhaps an old hymn, as he pours warm water into a bowl. Steam curls upward, ghostly, and the sailor closes his eyes. A cloth wipes his face, soap spreads like snow across his skin. The barber's hands are steady, practiced, almost tender. The razor gleams as it is drawn across the strop. Shk, shk, shk. The sound is hypnotic like breath, like the whisper of death itself rehearsing. The blade, honed to perfection, could split a hair, and in the story, it splits more. The sailor tilts his head, baring his throat. He sighs, trusting. The barber leans in. For an instant, all is still. Then one stroke, clean, swift, merciless. The throat opens, red blooming like roses against white linen. The sailor gurgles, chokes, eyes wide, then glassy. A final breath rattles, then silence. The barber steps back, face serene, as if the act were no more troubling than trimming a beard. He hums, wipes the blade clean, and sets it back among his tools. Then, methodical as a butcher, he tilts the chair. A hidden trapdoor creaks open. The body is dragged downward, swallowed by the cellar. The floorboards close, the chair is wiped clean. The room returns to stillness, as if nothing at all has happened. This, the legend insists, was the ritual repeated countless times. And yet it is the ordinariness of it that chills most. No torture, no flamboyant cruelty, only the quiet efficiency of a man at his trade, transformed into something monstrous. The barber does not kill in rage, nor in frenzy, but in rhythm, as natural to him as breathing. Murder becomes routine, the razor becomes more than steel, it becomes an extension of his hand, his will, his hunger. The cellar too takes on mythic dimension. Some claimed it stretched deep beneath the city, a labyrinth of tunnels lined with bones. Others swore it contained vats of brine, where flesh was salted, preserved, prepared. A few whispered that screams could be heard if one pressed an ear to the cobblestones at night. Whether truth or invention, the cellar became the imagined grave of the vanishing men, and above it all the chair remained, patient as death itself. There is something ritualistic about the barber's alleged method. First, the cleansing, the washing of the face, the lathering of the beard, the preparation of the victim as if for baptism, then the humming, soft, steady like chant. Finally, the cut, the stroke that ends one life and begins another, not into heaven but into the earth beneath the shop. It is a parody of sacrament, a mockery of grace turning intimacy into execution. One might ask, could such a crime truly be possible, repeated again and again without discovery? Skeptics point out the flaws. Blood has a scent, a stain, a persistence. A body, even dragged into a cellar, is not easily hidden. Neighbours would hear, would notice. Yet Seville was already a city steeped in blood and shadow. Knives flashed nightly in alleys, screams were not uncommon, and the stench of butchers and tanners masked worse odours. A scream muffled by four walls might be ignored, dismissed as drunken brawl or domestic quarrel. A smell of blood might blend with the slaughterhouses near the river. In a city accustomed to death, perhaps death could indeed pass unnoticed. And consider the victims, strangers, sailors, the poor. Men whose absence stirred no alarm, whose names dissolved before they were even spoken. To kill such men was to strike at shadows. Who would knock on the barber's door demanding justice for a nameless sailor lost in the night? Thus, the legend persists. The barber's razor became not only a tool of death, but a symbol of betrayal. The intimacy of trust shattered in a single stroke. And the chair became more than furniture. It became the stage of ritual sacrifice. Each victim seated, washed, lulled, and then dispatched, their bodies swallowed by the cellar, their flesh transformed, perhaps, into something unholy. Stories circulated of the barber's demeanour. Some claimed he was calm, smiling always, his eyes never betraying malice. Others swore he grew wild-eyed when the blade touched skin, humming louder, his hands trembling with hunger. A few insisted he drank the blood, lapping it from the razor before dragging the corpse below. None of these tales are proven, of course, but in legend, proof is unnecessary. Fear itself is evidence. The trapdoor, too, became central to the tale. Children whispered that it was greased with fat so the bodies slid easily into the cellar. Sailors insisted it opened with a single touch, smooth as a stage illusion. Housewives muttered that beneath it lay not a cellar, but a pit, a maw that devoured men whole. In truth, no such door has ever been found. But in the imagination of Seville it yawns eternally, waiting for the next man to sit in the chair. In the taverns, the story was told with grim relish. "He does not kill with rage," one man would whisper, "but with precision, like trimming a beard, quick, clean, efficient." "And the bodies?" another would ask, down the trapdoor, to the baker, to the oven. Laughter, uneasy, followed, but each man drank his wine faster and none lingered near the barber's door. The horror lies not only in the act, but in its simplicity. A single razor, a single chair, a single man humming, softly as throats open one after another. No torture, no spectacle, only routine death disguised as service. And that, perhaps, is why the story endures. For it suggests that beneath the ordinary rituals of life, shaving, grooming, eating, lurks the possibility of unimaginable betrayal. Night falls once more. The street lies silent. The bakery's chimney smokes, fragrant with spice and meat. The barber's shop stands shuttered, its candle burning low within. The chair gleams faintly. The razor lies ready. And somewhere in the city, another man approaches, weary, trusting, unaware. The barber hums, the blade gleams, the trapdoor waits, and Seville holds its breath. The oven glows in the dark like the mouth of hell. It breathes heat into the narrow street, its chimney coughing smoke that curls through the alleys of Seville. By day, it is a comfort. The smell of bread wafting into the square, promising nourishment. But by night, when the streets grow quiet and only the glow remains, the bakery becomes something else, a furnace that consumes the nameless and exhales their ghosts in ash. So the whispers said. The barber alone could not have concealed his crimes, the legend insisted. Throats may be cut, bodies dragged into cellars, but flesh has weight. Flesh must be disposed of. And here enters the accomplice most terrible, the baker next door, whose ovens never cooled, whose pies were praised for their richness. Together they formed a grotesque partnership, one to kill, one to cook, one to cut, one to consume. Neighbours remembered the smell. They swore that late at night, long after other ovens had gone cold, the baker's chimney still smoked. The scent was different, thicker, meatier, laced with spices that could not mask its heaviness. "Have you tasted her pies?" they muttered. Delicious, but strange. Too rich for pork, too dark for lamb, a flavour one could not place and did not wish to. And the pies themselves, the pies. Golden crusts, steaming hot, flaky as parchment. Sold cheaply, almost suspiciously so, to sailors and beggars who could afford little else. Men ate them greedily, licking grease from their fingers, smacking their lips. They praised the baker's generosity, her skill, her seasoning. Better than beef, they declared. Better than anything. And only later, when the whispers took hold, did they shudder to remember the taste. The horror is not merely that flesh was used, but that it was consumed by the innocent. That men, women, even children may have eaten their neighbours, their friends, strangers whose faces they passed in the street. That sin was not only committed but ingested, swallowed with trust, digested without question. In a Catholic city where bread was sanctified as the body of Christ, what greater blasphemy could there be than bread filled with human remains? The baker herself, in memory, was as ordinary as her alleged accomplice. Some described her as a matron, stout and cheerful, flour on her hands. Others painted her as a widow, dour and silent, eyes downcast as she kneaded dough. No one agreed on her features, her age, her name. But this only sharpened the terror. Like the barber, she could be anyone. Any oven could hide unholy secrets. Any pie could be tainted. Children invented rhymes about her. Eat the pie, lose your eye, eat the bread, join the dead. They dared one another to steal crusts from her counter, then shrieked with laughter when none would take a bite. Housewives, once eager customers, began to mutter suspicions, warning one another in hushed tones. Some claimed they had seen blood on her apron not from butchering pork but from something else, something unspeakable. And still, the pies sold. Hunger has a way of silencing doubt. For this was Seville, where famine was never far, where bread riots shook the streets, where a handful of flour could mean life or death. The poor did not ask questions of meat that filled their bellies. They ate and later they whispered. Perhaps they whispered because they feared deep down they already knew. The legend of the cannibal pies was not unique to Seville. In France, tales of human flesh sold as pâté had long circulated, often tied to barbers and bakers. In Italy, rumours swirled of butchers who fed famine-struck cities with mystery meat, too suspiciously abundant in lean times. And in England, decades later, the story of Sweeney Todd would entwine a murderous barber with a pie maker, their partnership cemented in Victorian nightmares. But Seville's version carries its own flavour, rooted in Catholic dread, in hunger, in the uneasy closeness of neighbours. For the city was intimate, its streets narrow, its people pressed together. To imagine that the food bought from a neighbour's oven might contain the flesh of the man who vanished last week was to admit that horror could live next door, could be eaten at one's own table. The symbolism runs deeper still. The barber kills in silence, in shadows. The baker transforms that silence into sustenance, disguising death as nourishment. Together they enact a grotesque parody of communion. Flesh becomes bread. Sin becomes supper. The body of the victim becomes the body of the city, and the people consume themselves, unknowingly, piece by piece. Stories grew wild in the telling. Some claimed that nobles had unknowingly feasted on the pies, praising their flavour at banquets. Others swore that priests, even monks, had been served the unholy flesh, their blessings falling on cannibal meals. A few whispered that the baker herself had laughed as she watched men devour her wares, knowing what they swallowed. Truth mattered little, the image was enough. The pies became cursed in memory. Sailors swore off street food. Housewives crossed themselves when passing bakeries. Children spat at oven doors for fear of being tricked into eating the dead. Yet even as suspicion spread, the story also fascinated. To eat human flesh without knowing, was it sin or innocence? Were those who tasted guilty, or were they victims too? Some theologians of the time even mused on it in hushed tones. If one unknowingly consumed flesh, was one damned, or was ignorance absolution? The Inquisition, when pressed, offered no clear answer. Silence, as always, spoke louder than decree, and so the baker's pies, whether real or imagined, became symbols of the darkest fears, of hunger twisting morality, of neighbours betraying neighbours, of innocence transformed into guilt by the simplest act of eating. Night falls once more. The barber's chair gleams in the candlelight, its razor honed to perfection. The trapdoor yawns, and next door the oven glows, its fire never dying, its chimney coughing smoke into the civilian night. Inside, the baker works in silence, flour dusting her arms, dough beneath her fingers. She hums as she needs, as though echoing the barber's tune. She does not look to the cellar door, she does not ask what meat is brought to her, she only bakes. The pies emerge golden, steaming, irresistible, and outside hungry men wait, coins in hand, ready to buy. They bite, they chew, they smile. They do not know, they do not wish to. The oven glows, the pies vanish, the city sleeps, and the legend sharpens its teeth. The whispers had swollen to a roar. By now too many men had vanished. Too many pies had been consumed with uneasy glances. Too many mothers had warned their children to stay away from the barber's shutters. Seville could no longer ignore the tale. Fear, once confined to taverns and back alleys, spilled into daylight. Merchants muttered at market stalls. Sailors refused to enter the crooked street. Housewives crossed themselves as they hurried past the bakery, clutching their loaves as if they might turn to ash in their hands. It was only a matter of time before the authorities could not remain deaf. The city's watch was no stranger to gore. They patrolled streets where knives flashed nightly, dragged corpses from the Guadalquivir, broke up brawls in taverns where blood slicked the floors. But this was something darker. Cannibalism, sacrilege. A crime whispered in the same breath as heresy, as witchcraft, as dealings with the devil, and to ignore it was to risk scandal that might consume not just the street, but the city itself. And so one night torches flickered through the alleys. Boots struck cobblestones. The barber's door, silent for so long, felt the weight of fists pounding against it. "En nombre del rey!" the cry rang. In the name of the king. No answer. The door shuddered beneath the strike of a shoulder, then splintered. The watch burst inside. The scene they entered was ordinary, too ordinary. A chair sat in the centre, gleaming faintly in the light of a guttering candle. Tools lay neatly arranged. Combs, brushes, razors. The air smelled faintly of soap, faintly of oil. No blood pooled on the floor. No body slumped in the shadows. Only silence. But silence itself was suspicious. A guard stooped, touched the floorboards, frowned. His hand came away damp, stained dark. Another bent to the boards and rapped them with his knuckles, hollow. A shout rose. A crowbar tore wood from wood. The trapdoor yawned open, a mouth into the earth. And from its throat wafted a stench so foul, so heavy that men staggered back gagging. Torches lowered into the darkness revealed the cellar. And there, bones, piles of them scattered like kindling. Ribs gnawed clean, femurs cracked open, skulls grinning in the torchlight. Flesh clung to some, still blackened, half-rotten. Rats fled as the light touched them, squealing into corners. The floor was slick, the walls streaked with dark stains. Buckets stood brimming with congealed blood. Knives rusted with it. Hooks jutted from beams, from which hung rags that might once have been clothing or skin. The guards recoiled, cursing, crossing themselves. Some fled up the ladder, vomiting into the street. Those who remained swore they had never seen such horror, not even in war. This was not slaughter for necessity. It was ritual, repeated, methodical, a butcher's work, and then the bakery. The watch swarmed next door, battering down the door. The oven glowed hot, its embers roaring. The baker was seized, dragged screaming into the street. Within the shop, trays of pies steamed, their scent thick and sweet. But when one was broken open, the meat inside was unlike pork, unlike beef, stringy, dark, cloying bones, small and unmistakably human, lay in a bucket by the door, ready to be ground for broth. The crowd that had gathered outside gasped, shrieked, crossed themselves. Some fainted, some cursed the name of God aloud, some spat at the baker as she was hauled away, others wept, recalling the meals they had eaten from her hand. "I fed my child with her bread," a mother screamed, clawing at her hair. "Monstruos demonios!" Monsters, demons. Torches lit the night as the barber and the baker were dragged into the square. The barber, they say, was calm, his face serene as though none of it touched him. He hummed under his breath as the guards bound his wrists, his eyes half closed in something like reverie. The baker shrieked, fought, spat curses. Together they were paraded before the city, no longer whispers but spectacle. The cellar was sealed, its contents carried into daylight for all to see. Bones stacked like cordwood, skulls grinning from wagons, flesh dumped in heaps for the horrified to gawk at. The pies were displayed, broken open, their filling exposed, and the crowd howled. This, the legend insists, was the day Seville looked into its own mirror and recoiled. The day suspicion became proof, whispers became screams, and the demon barber was no longer a shadow but a man, his blade still gleaming faintly in the torchlight. But history is murkier. No trial records survive, no archive in Seville mentions such a raid. The bones, the blood, the pies, all are described only in rumour, in retellings, in stories passed down from mouth to mouth until detail became certainty. Was there truly a cellar beneath the barber's shop? Did the watch truly drag steaming pies into the square? Or did the city invent the discovery to satisfy its hunger for horror? For in truth the story of the discovery appears in many places, in many forms. Paris had its barber and baker exposed when drains clogged with bones. Florence had its butcher's cellar, unearthed by accident. London would one day have its Fleet Street, where Sweeney Todd's victims were revealed in hidden vaults. The pattern repeats, as though each city must have its moment of revelation, its grotesque unveiling, its day when rumour becomes spectacle. Seville's version, however, is told with particular fervour. Perhaps because its people feared hunger so deeply, the idea of pies filled with flesh struck harder. Perhaps because the church held sway, the blasphemy of communion corrupted made the tale unbearable. Or perhaps because Seville, with its labyrinthine streets and decaying grandeur, was the perfect stage for such Gothic theatre. Whether true or false, the image remains vivid. Torches flickering against whitewashed walls, guards dragging screaming figures into the square, bones piled high, pies broken open, the city gasping in horror. A chair empty at last, its razor confiscated, its trapdoor sealed. The barber's shop stands silent. The oven cools, but the smoke lingers, curling into the night as though carrying with it the souls of the vanishing men. And Seville, whether or not it truly witnessed this horror, would never again forget it. The square is never silent when blood is promised. News of the barber and the baker's arrest spread through Seville like wildfire, and with it came a fever of anticipation. Whispers that once skulked in taverns now roared in daylight. The barber who slit throats, the baker who fed flesh to the city. Neighbours clutched their children close, muttered prayers, and swore they had suspected all along. Men who had once laughed at the story now claimed they had always known it true. The city demanded not only punishment, but spectacle. In 18th century Spain, justice was not confined to courtrooms. It was theatre, a lesson carved into flesh, a sermon written in blood. Executions were staged to terrify as much as to punish, and in Seville, where the Inquisition still cast its shadow, punishment and penance were entwined. A murderer was not merely a criminal, he was a sinner, a demon in flesh, an affront to God. To kill him was not enough. He must be displayed, condemned, consumed by fire or blade so that all might learn. So it was that the barber and the baker, nameless in record yet infamous in legend, were brought to trial. The tribunal convened in a hall that stank of wax and sweat. Robed judges sat stern behind benches, their eyes cold, their quills poised. The barber stood, silent, his wrists bound, his face unreadable. Some swore he smiled faintly, humming under his breath. The baker, by contrast, wept and wailed, clawed at her bonds, cursed her accusers. Witnesses were summoned. Sailors who swore their comrades had vanished. Housewives who spoke of strange smells from the bakery. Children who told tales of screams in the night. No bodies were presented, no names of victims offered beyond rumour. Yet the evidence was not material, but emotional. Fear itself testified. The crowd that filled the hall needed no bones to be convinced. Their hunger was for vengeance, not proof. The verdict, inevitable, was guilty. Guilty of murder, guilty of cannibalism, guilty of blasphemy, of feeding Christian flesh to Christians, of mocking the very body of Christ. And so sentence was passed. Execution, public, spectacular. The day of reckoning dawned with bells tolling not for mass but for death. Seville awoke in fever. Crowds surged toward the Plaza Mayor, where a scaffold had been raised. Merchants abandoned their stalls, priests their prayers, children their games. All came to witness the fall of monsters. For in that age, executions were not grim necessities. They were theatre, ritual, carnival. The barber and the baker were dragged from their cells, chains clanking, guards flanking them. The barber walked calmly, head bowed, lips moving in what some swore was prayer, others swore was song. The baker fought, screamed, spat curses. Together they were paraded through the streets, jeered and pelted with rotten fruit. "Monstruos!" the crowd howled. "Cannibales! Al infierno con vosotros!" Monsters. Cannibals. To hell with you. The scaffold loomed above the square. At its centre stood the stake, piled high with wood and kindling. Fire was the chosen punishment, fitting for crimes deemed not only mortal but infernal. Fire purifies, fire consumes, fire returns the body to ash, leaving nothing but smoke for heaven or hell. The barber was bound first. His face remained serene, his eyes closed, his lips still moving. When asked for final words, he only murmured, "Todos son clientes aún." They are all customers still. The crowd shrieked at the blasphemy, convinced he spoke not to men but to demons. The baker followed, dragged, thrashing, her screams piercing. She cursed the crowd, cursed God, cursed the day she was born. Her voice broke into sobs as the ropes tightened, but her fury did not fade. Torches were lowered, flame-kissed wood. Smoke curled upward, acrid and heavy. The crowd pressed closer, their faces lit by the glow, their eyes wide. Some cheered, some prayed, some wept. Children clung to their mothers, peering between fingers. The barber stood still as fire licked his legs, his face calm until the smoke engulfed him. Some swore he did not scream, only hummed until his breath was gone. The baker shrieked, wailed, convulsed, her cries rising above the roar of flame, until finally they broke into silence. The fire consumed them both, leaving only ash, only soak, only memory. The crowd dispersed, some satisfied, some shaken, yet none forgot. The story of the demon barber and his baker accomplice was carved not in record but in the hearts of all who witnessed, or who later claimed they had. And so the trial became legend, even if it never truly occurred. For here, once again, history falters. No archival record exists of such a trial in Seville. No names, no sentences, no executions are written in the city's meticulous annals. Skeptics argue the trial was invention, a dramatization, a way for rumour to reach its climax. After all, every legend demands a reckoning, every monster a downfall. Without it, the tale would remain unsatisfying. So the people supplied one. The barber and the baker, whether they lived or not, were condemned in the imagination of Seville. They were tried in whispers, executed in stories, their ashes scattered in memory rather than in plazas. Yet to those who repeated the tale, the details were vivid, undeniable. The trapdoor, the bones, the pies, the scaffold, the fire. And thus the trial endures not in lore but in legend, an echo of Spain's taste for spectacle, of justice staged as theatre, of morality enforced not by truth, but by fear. The square empties, the ashes cool, smoke drifts upward, curling into the night, but the whisper remains, drifting through the streets of Seville. Beware the barber, beware the baker, for even in death their hunger lingers. Europe has always whispered of cannibals. Long before Seville's barber and baker were said to ply their unholy trade, stories spread across the continent of men who vanished into shops, of pies filled with unspeakable meat, of trusted neighbours revealed as monsters. The legend of the demon barber was not born in isolation. It was the child of older fears, retold in new streets, sharpened by each tongue that repeated it. What happened in Seville was terrifying precisely because it echoed what had already been feared elsewhere. It was a chorus of nightmares sung in many languages, each verse changing, but the refrain always the same. Beware the ones who hold your throat. Beware the food you place upon your tongue. In France, centuries earlier, the tale had already taken form. On the Rue des Marmotzets in Paris, so the chronicles claimed, there stood a barber's shop and a bakery side by side. Travellers and students who entered the barber's chair were never seen again. Their throats cut, their bodies butchered. Their flesh was carried next door, baked into pies, and sold to unsuspecting Parisians. The story ends with discovery, with bones unearthed beneath the shops, with barber and baker burned alive. Some said the tale was true, preserved in medieval records. Others called it an invention, a Gothic morality play. Yet it persisted, whispered even centuries later, carried across borders as though horror itself had taken wings. Italy had its share as well. In Florence, rumours spread during famine years of butchers who sold human flesh as pork. In Naples, whispers told of bakers who mixed human remains into their bread when grain failed. The stories always surfaced when hunger gnawed at bellies, when the line between survival and sin grew thin. Cannibalism was the most feared of all taboos, the act that turned man into beast, Christian into devil. And so it haunted the imagination, attaching itself to familiar trades, places where trust was demanded and betrayal would cut deepest. England too would nurture its barber legend. In London, the name that would one day eclipse all others began to stir in whispers: Sweeney Todd. By the 19th century he would stride onto the stage, immortalised in penny dreadfuls and melodramas, his victims dispatched in a Fleet Street shop, their bodies baked into pies by his accomplice, Mrs. Lovett. But even in earlier centuries, Londoners muttered of barbers with bloodied hands, of pies too rich to be believed. Todd himself may have been invention, yet his legend grew so strong it came to be treated as truth, his name uttered as though he had once walked the cobblestones in flesh and blood. What binds these tales together is not evidence, but fear. Fear that those we trust most may betray us. The barber holds a razor to our throat. The baker feeds us what we cannot see. These are intimate exchanges, vulnerable moments. To sit in the barber's chair is to surrender one's life into his hands. To eat bread is to place absolute faith in the honesty of the one who baked it. To twist these moments into horror is to poison trust at its very root. And perhaps this is why the tales persist across Europe. They take what is ordinary and make it monstrous. They suggest that nowhere is safe, not even the most mundane rituals of life. A shave, a loaf of bread, a shared meal, these become traps. Trust becomes a blade. Hunger becomes damnation. The church too played its part in shaping how such stories were remembered. Cannibalism was not merely a crime, it was a sin of the deepest kind. To consume human flesh was to invert the sacrament, to mock the Eucharist, to devour the body not of Christ but of one's fellow man. Such legends therefore became tools of teaching, examples of what happens when faith falters, when hunger rules, when sin is allowed to fester in shadows. The barber and the baker became parables as much as criminals, whether real or imagined mattered little compared to the lesson they embodied. But one must ask, why barbers, why bakers again and again? The answer lies in the tools and in the trust. A barber holds a blade inches from the throat of every customer. His profession is one of intimacy, of exposure, of vulnerability. Death is always just a slip away. A baker, by contrast, provides sustenance, transforms raw grain into food. To pervert that role, to feed poison or flesh instead of bread, is to strike at the very core of communal life. These trades carry both power and danger, and so they become fertile ground for legends. Seville's barber, then, was not alone. He was an echo of Paris, a sibling of Florence, a precursor of London. Whether he lived or not, his story took shape because the soil was ready, watered by centuries of European nightmares. The citizens of Seville did not invent him. They inherited him, reshaped him, placed him within their own labyrinth of alleys and hunger. He became theirs, even as he belonged to the continent. And so the legend grew stronger with each retelling. A French traveller passing through Seville might recall the Rue des Marmousets and mutter that he had heard such horrors before. An Italian sailor eating a pie near the cathedral might whisper of Florence's famine tales. A Spaniard, hearing of London's Fleet Street years later, might nod grimly and say, "Yes, we too had our barber." The stories fed one another, like flames licking across borders, consuming fact and fiction alike until only ash and rumour remained. It is tempting to dismiss them all as folklore, as carnival ghost stories meant to frighten children. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, there is always truth. People did vanish. Bodies were found in rivers, alleys, pits. Hunger did drive men to desperate acts. But the legend reshapes truth into something more enduring, more symbolic. It takes scattered disappearances, isolated crimes, and weaves them into a tapestry of betrayal and horror that lingers long after memory of real victims has faded. What Europe feared most was not merely hunger or death, but betrayal by the ordinary. Not brigands in the forest, but the barber on the corner. Not wolves at the gate, but the baker next door. The fear that the familiar could turn monstrous, that those who serve could slaughter, that those who feed could poison, that fear knows no border. Thus the barber of Seville is remembered not because he was proven, but because he was possible. Because in a world where men vanished and hunger gnawed, the thought of a razor flashing, of pies steaming with flesh, was too close to truth to be dismissed. And when Seville whispered of its demon barber, Europe listened, nodding, shuddering, for it had whispered the same before and would whisper it again. The barber's chair, the baker's oven, these are not merely Spanish horrors. They are European ones, retold in different streets, dressed in different clothes, but always the same at their core: a razor, a trapdoor, an oven, a pie, flesh consumed by those who never knew. The imagination of Europe is a dark place, and in it, the cannibal barber forever sharpens his blade. Fear is the oldest storyteller. Hunger is its cruelest accomplice. Long before Seville whispered of its demon barber, Europe had already dreamt of cannibals. The tales surfaced not in times of plenty, but in times of famine, when fields wither and bellies gnaw themselves hollow. It is hunger that makes men see monsters in their neighbours. It is fear that gives those monsters names, and once named, they are never forgotten. Seville's tale of razors and pies was born from such soil. The 18th century was not a time of easy comfort. Spain's golden age of empire had bled into decline. Wealth siphoned to Cadiz, crops failing more often than they succeeded. Epidemics stalked the land. Families starved, riots flared, and the poor became shadows in the alleys, bones beneath their skin, eyes wide with desperation. Hunger breeds suspicion. Hunger turns bread into mystery, meat into menace. A loaf too heavy, a pie too rich, and whispers begin, what is it made of truly? The fear of cannibalism is older still. During the medieval famines that swept Europe, accusations of eating human flesh arose like fever. Chronicles tell of parents devouring their children, of strangers lured into homes and never leaving. Often these were exaggerations, fables woven from desperation. But in famine's grip, such stories felt possible. To imagine one's neighbour boiling flesh for stew was both unthinkable and terrifyingly near. The accusation itself became a way to explain the unexplainable, to place horror outside oneself. Folklore thrives on this tension between necessity and taboo. The barber and baker of Seville are only the latest masks of an ancient dread. Their legend is less about them than about the people who told it. To fear the barber's razor was to fear vulnerability, to fear betrayal of trust. To fear the baker's oven was to fear hunger itself, to fear that what we eat might corrupt us. Both are reflections of a deeper unease, that survival might demand acts too monstrous to speak aloud. Cannibalism has always been more than an act of flesh. It is a metaphor. In Europe's imagination, it stood for greed, for sin, for the devouring of one another in pursuit of gain. To eat human flesh was to become beast, to surrender to hunger so absolute it annihilated the soul. And so the stories came, the innkeeper who served travellers in pies, the butcher who salted flesh as pork, the barber who slit throats and fed his victims to the oven next door. These were not random inventions. They emerged from the cracks of society, from places where the poor brushed shoulders with the rich, where hunger glared into abundance. A noble might feast in a palace while peasants starved outside. How natural, then, to tell stories of food laced with horror, of pies filled with human meat. The legend became a weapon, a way for the poor to whisper of injustice without naming it outright. The barber and baker were scapegoats, yes, but also symbols of a world where the powerful fed upon the powerless. In Seville, the tale carried a particular sting. The city's wealth had been bled away, yet its churches still glittered with gold, its processions paraded relics through streets where beggars starved. What better symbol of corruption than the idea that even the bread of the people was tainted, that hunger itself had been turned into a trap? The barber's razor cut not only throats but trust. The baker's oven baked not only flesh but betrayal. Together they embodied the city's own contradictions, beauty masking rot, piety hiding sin, and yet, for all its horror, the legend also offered a kind of comfort. For in naming the evil, in placing it within two shops, two people, the city contained it. Hunger, betrayal, sin. These were vast, uncontrollable forces. But if they could be given a face, a chair, an oven, then they could be condemned, destroyed, burned to ash. The story allowed people to believe that the horror was not everywhere, not within themselves, but confined to others. That by killing the barber and baker, by whispering their names, the city could purge its fear, but folklore is never so easily tamed. The story did not die with its supposed villains. It lingered, spreading across borders, attaching itself to new cities, new names. Each famine, each plague, each season of want gave it fresh breath. Mothers warned their children not to wander into strange shops. Sailors laughed nervously as they bit into pies. Priests preached against gluttony, using the legend as a parable of sin devouring the sinner. The tale was nourishment for fear, and fear is an appetite that never starves. And so the barber's chair remains empty yet occupied, a symbol of vulnerability. The baker's oven remains cold yet burning, a symbol of hunger. Together they are not merely a story of crime, but a mirror held up to society's darkest corners. When hunger bites, when fear sets, when trust wavers, the barber and baker return. They are not individuals. They are archetypes, embodiments of what people fear most. Betrayal in intimacy, corruption in sustenance. The neighbour transformed into monster. There are those who argue such legends were tools of control, spread deliberately by authorities or clergy, to warn against sin, to frighten the populace into obedience, to direct suspicion away from the powerful and onto ordinary trades. There may be truth in this, yet stories once born grow beyond their makers. They take root in the collective mind, reshaping themselves, sharpening their edges, living on long after the circumstances that birthed them have faded. The demon barber of Seville, then, is not merely a ghost of one city. He is hunger itself given flesh, fear itself given a blade. He is the whisper of famine, the shadow of betrayal, the echo of centuries of want. Whether or not he lived matters less than the fact that he was believed, that his story found a home in a city already haunted by need. The barber hums, the baker kneads, the razor gleams, the oven glows. They live not in archives but in imagination, eternal, waiting for each generation to rediscover them. For so long as men hunger, the barber will sharpen his blade. So long as bread is baked, the baker's oven will smoke. And so long as fear whispers in the dark, tales of cannibalism will rise, again feeding the imagination as surely as flesh once fed the oven. Seville was a city of bells. Their toll carried over rooftops, across the river, into every crooked alley. They rang for mass, for weddings, for funerals. They rang to remind the faithful that time belonged not to man but to God. Yet beneath their music lay another rhythm, the rasp of razors, the whisper of rumour, the murmured prayers of a city afraid. The church had always known how to listen to fear. Fear was fertile soil. It softened hearts, bent knees, filled pews. In a world where death lurked in every cough, where famine stalked every harvest, the church spoke as interpreter of terror. It named sins, named demons, offered salvation at a price, and when Seville whispered of a barber who slit throats and a baker who fed flesh to the city, the church listened, and then it spoke. Cannibalism was no ordinary crime. Theft could be confessed, adultery forgiven, even murder repented. But cannibalism, this was heresy in its rawest form, a blasphemy that mocked the Eucharist itself. At every Mass, bread became the body of Christ, wine his blood. To eat human flesh outside this sacrament was to parody holiness, to twist sacred mystery into grotesque mockery. To eat one's neighbour was not just a crime, it was to consume damnation, and so the barber's razor became more than a weapon. It was preached as an instrument of Satan, a blade that severed not only veins, but the bond between man and God. Priests warned from pulpits that to sit in the wrong chair, to place trust in the wrong hands, was to gamble with one's soul. The barber in their sermons was not merely a killer, he was a tempter, a whispering devil in human guise. His humming became chant to the infernal choir, his cellar a chapel of hell. The baker fared no better in their telling. Her oven became the mouth of the abyss, her pies an unholy communion. To eat her wares was to feast with demons, to ingest sin as food. Priests painted images of innocents unknowingly swallowing corruption, their souls blackened bite by bite. Housewives hearing these words crossed themselves and shuddered. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. The baker, whether she lived or not, became a symbol etched into collective imagination. The smiling neighbour who feeds you poison, the trusted hand that betrays. The church did not need proof, it needed lesson. And so it told the story with relish. In sermons, in confessions, in whispered warnings, the tale spread. Each retelling sharpened the moral. Beware of hunger, for it tempts to sin. Beware of gluttony, for it devours the soul. Beware of misplaced trust, for even the kindest face may mask the devil's work. Was this manipulation? Perhaps. The Inquisition, though waning by the late 18th century, still clung to power in Spain. It thrived on fear, on tales that blurred the line between crime and heresy. To whisper of cannibal barbers and bakers was to reinforce its claim. Only through the church could one be safe, only through faith could one resist the devil's snares. The barber and baker became examples, tools of instruction, shadows raised high so that light might seem brighter. But the story also escaped their grasp. Fear has a way of slipping chains. What priests intended as cautionary parable became something darker, wilder. People began to see shadows of the barber everywhere, to suspect bakers of hiding unholy ingredients, to mutter that the devil walked not in distant lands but next door. The church had amplified fear, but in doing so it lost control of it. The barber was no longer just a sermon, he was a ghost in every alley, a whisper in every oven's smoke, and yet the sermons endured. The razor, priests intoned, is the devil's tongue, sharp and deceitful. The oven, they warned, is the pit of hell disguised as hearth. They reminded the faithful that Christ had given his body willingly, while the barber stole bodies in secret. Communion was sacrifice, cannibalism was theft. The distinction mattered less in logic than in symbolism. One fed the soul, the other damned it. The legend thus took root not only in fear of hunger, but in fear of sin. The barber's shop became an allegory for temptation, a place that looked safe, even comforting, but hid death beneath its surface. The baker's oven became an allegory for appetite, the danger of consuming without questioning, of filling the body at the expense of the soul. The story's power lay not in whether it was true, but in how it spoke to truths already feared. And what of the barber himself in this ecclesiastical retelling? He became almost satanic, a figure of inversion. Where the priest blesses, he kills. Where the priest feeds, he corrupts. Where the priest offers salvation, he offers damnation. To sit in his chair was to take communion with the devil. To eat his pies was to partake in the feast of hell. Even centuries later, when rationalists dismissed the legend as folklore, its moral undertones remained. Guides whisper it on ghost tours. Priests mention it in hushed warnings about temptation. Parents repeat it to children as a lesson against strangers. The barber's razor still gleams in memory, not as a mere tool of murder, but as a symbol of sin's subtle blade, always sharper than expected. The church and the razor, together they shaped the story. The church gave it moral weight, turned rumour into parable, made the barber not only a killer but a demon, and in doing so it ensured that he would never be forgotten. For monsters fade, but lessons endure. The barber may or may not have lived, but the razor remains, gleaming in every sermon, every whispered warning, every story told to frighten and guide. And in the glow of the cathedral candles, as the bells toll and incense thickens the air, one can almost hear it. The faint hum of a barber's song, the whisper of steel on strop. A reminder that even in the house of God, fear walks at the edges. Stories are restless things. They do not sit quietly where they are born. They slip beneath doors, ride on wagons, cross oceans in sailors' mouths. They grow in retelling, shedding and sprouting details like serpents changing skins. What began in Seville, whether as whispered rumour, grim reality, or both, did not remain there. The barber with the razor and the baker with the oven stepped out of their narrow street and wandered across Europe, taking new faces, new names, but always carrying the same hunger. Imagine a traveller leaving Seville in the late 18th century. He has heard the tale in a tavern, whispered over cheap wine by sailors who swear they knew men who vanished. He carries it with him like a souvenir of horror. In Cadiz he tells it again, adding his own flourish. Perhaps he claims he saw the shuttered shop or tasted the pies himself. The story sharpens as he speaks it, polished by his own fear. Others hear, repeat, carry it further. In Madrid it changes again. In Lisbon it acquires new flourishes. By the time it reaches Paris it is no longer the same story. Yet at its core the barber still sharpens his blade and the oven still smoulders. In Paris the tale feels familiar. Centuries earlier their own Rue des Marmousets had given birth to nearly the same horror. A barber who killed travellers, a baker who sold their flesh. French chroniclers swore bones were found beneath the shops, that both villains were burned alive. Was Seville's story a shadow of Paris's, reborn in Spanish alleys? Or was it the other way around, each city borrowing and reshaping, feeding its hunger for the grotesque? No one could say. Legends are thieves. They steal from one another until no one remembers who spoke first. But what mattered was not origin, it was performance. The tale lent itself to dramatization. The trapdoor, the chair, the oven, the pies, each detail vivid, theatrical, easily staged, and so, inevitably, it moved from whispers to boards. The travelling troops of Spain were notorious for carrying tales across the peninsula. Juglares and storytellers, actors and puppeteers, these were the true arteries of folklore. In smoky taverns they told of a barber who slit throats with a song, of a baker whose pies concealed a horror. In town squares they performed crude dramas where a foolish sailor sat in the fatal chair, the barber's razor flashing, the crowd gasping in mock terror. The baker entered with a steaming pie, the smell of real pastry mingling with the fiction of human flesh. The crowd laughed, shuddered, crossed themselves and begged for more. Horror, when staged, became entertainment. From Spain the story migrated further. Italian performers carried it in commedia dell'arte sketches, folding it into their grotesque stock characters. In France it merged with their own marmoset legend, retold in pamphlets and stage farces. Each culture seasoned it differently. Sometimes the barber was a madman, sometimes a cold professional, sometimes even a devil in disguise. The baker, too, shifted from cackling accomplice to weeping victim, a woman forced into crime by circumstance. But always the pies remained. By the 19th century the legend flowered most spectacularly in England. London, already steeped in industrial squalor, crime and cheap theatre, embraced the tale as though it had always belonged there. In Penny Dreadfuls the barber became Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. His victims dispatched by trapdoor into a cellar, their flesh baked into pies by Mrs. Lovett. London audiences devoured the story with relish. They laughed, gasped and shrieked in delight as Todd's razor flashed and Lovett's oven smoked. Theatres sold out night after night. The legend had crossed from whispered horror to mass entertainment, from rumour to Gothic myth. But behind the laughter and applause lingered the same unease. Why did the story grip so fiercely? Why did people return to it again and again? Because it played upon the same primal fears that had birthed it in Seville. The barber represented betrayal of intimacy, death where trust should reign. The baker represented betrayal of sustenance, corruption where nourishment should be found. To watch the tale unfold on stage was to confront those fears in safety, to taste horror without swallowing it whole. In Seville, the barber had been a ghost in the alley, a whisper in the marketplace. On stage, he became flesh, voice, gesture. The actor stropped his razor with exaggerated menace. His song carried over the crowd. His trapdoor thudded loudly as bodies fell. The baker minced and rolled dough with flour-dusted hands, only to reveal the horror of her filling with a wicked grin. The audience gasped, then laughed. The tension released. Horror became carnival. Nightmare turned into spectacle. Yet even as entertainment, the story never lost its edge. Parents still warned children of barbers with sharp razors, of pies that tasted too rich. Priests still used the legend in sermons, pointing to the stage and saying, "See how sin devours?" The barber and baker danced between worlds, half parable, half performance, half warning, half amusement. They were monsters and clowns at once, demons who entertained as they terrified. And what of Seville? The city that first whispered the tale, or perhaps only borrowed it, never entirely shook its claim. Guides in later centuries pointed to certain streets, certain shuttered shops, insisting, here is where it happened. Ghost tours still murmur of the trapdoor beneath the chair, of ovens that smoked too long into the night. Locals shake their heads, deny, laugh, and then glance quickly down the street as if not entirely certain. For once a city is marked by a story, it carries that scar forever. From Seville to Paris, from Florence to London, the barber's razor has never dulled. Each culture sharpened it, anew, honing the edge, stropping the blade with their own fears. Each oven glowed with its own fire, each pie baked with its own guilt, and the audience, whether in taverns, marketplaces, theatres, or penny dreadfuls, consumed the story as eagerly as the pies within it. What began as a whisper became folklore, then theatre, then legend, then myth. Today, the demon barber is known by many names, but his roots remain tangled in Europe's hunger, fear, and fascination with betrayal. His razor still gleams in memory, his oven still smokes in imagination, his victims still vanish through trapdoors in the mind's eye. And as long as people crave stories that chill even as they amuse, the barber of Seville will sit forever in his chair, humming softly, waiting for the curtain to rise again. Seville does not forget. It pretends, yes, it buries, it gilds, it dances in festivals beneath banners of saints. But beneath the music and incense, beneath the shimmer of tiles and the perfume of orange blossoms, memory lingers like smoke. The barber with his razor, the baker with her oven, they have become less history than haunting, a story too potent to die even when denied. Walk the streets at night and you can feel it. The labyrinth of alleys folds upon itself, whitewashed walls leaning close like conspirators. The lamps burn weak, their glow swallowed by shadow. The cathedral looms above, its bells heavy with centuries of tolling. Somewhere a guitar strums, a voice sings mournful, and then silence descends, thick and uneasy, broken only by footsteps on stone. You find yourself glancing at doorways, at shuttered windows, at darkened shops. Any of them could have been the place. None of them are, and yet all of them are. Guides lead visitors through these alleys now, their lanterns flickering, their voices low. Here, they whisper, pausing before a nondescript doorway, was the barber's shop. The very chair once stood beyond that wall. The trapdoor lies sealed beneath the stones. The tourists lean closer, their faces pale in the dim light, eyes straining to pierce the dark. The guide lets silence hang, then lowers his voice further. And here, next door, was the bakery. Her oven burned long into the night. They say you can still smell the smoke if the wind shifts just so. Sometimes the guides disagree. Another insists the shop was further down, on Calle del Hombre de Piedra or nearer the river. Another points to an abandoned building, claiming its cellar still hides bones. The uncertainty only feeds the legend. The barber's shop becomes less a place than a presence, a ghost inhabiting whichever doorway you fear most. Locals smile at these tales, shake their heads, call them nonsense. No proof, they say, no records, just stories. Yet when pressed, many admit unease. My grandmother swore she heard screams near the square, one might confess. My uncle refused to eat meat pies until the day he died. A woman recalls walking home at dusk, the street empty, when she felt the distinct scent of iron and smoke rise from nowhere. Like a blade just sharpened, she whispers, crossing herself. Ghost tours speak of shadows glimpsed in shuttered windows, of footsteps in empty alleys, of humming, always humming, drifting from nowhere. The song is faint, tuneless but unmistakable. Guides tell their groups to hush, and in the silence, some swear they hear it. The hum of a man at work stropping a blade for a customer who will never leave. Legends cling hardest to places that do not resist them. Seville, with its twisted streets, its mixture of splendour and ruin, its history steeped in both sanctity and blood, provides the perfect soil. Even if the barber never lived, he belongs here. His shop may never have stood, yet every shadow could be his. His oven may never have smoked, yet every scent of roasting meat carries his ghost. Children still dare one another to play barber and baker. One sits in a chair, the other mimes stropping a blade, another pretends to knead dough. Laughter follows, but it is uneasy, shrill, too loud. Teachers scold them, mothers hush them, but the game continues, generation to generation. The barber remains, teaching children fear as play, memory as laughter. Writers and poets too keep his ghost alive. Pamphlets in the 19th century described his crimes as though true. Local histories mention him with a shrug, some say it happened here. Playwrights borrow his razor, novelists his oven. Modern ghost stories place him beside the city's other phantoms, the weeping nun, the Moorish knight, the lovers turned to stone. But the barber is different. He is not only a ghost, he is hunger. He is betrayal. He is the fear of trusting what should never be doubted. To sit in a barber's chair is still to feel faintly a whisper of unease. The razor hovers close, gleaming in the light. The barber hums softly, a habit of concentration. For a moment one wonders, what if the story were true? What if the hand slipped, or did not slip at all? And when you leave, clean-shaven, you laugh at your own nerves. But the thought remains, a ghost at the edge of your mind. Likewise the bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifts from ovens at dawn, rich and comforting. Yet in Seville, some swear the scent always carries a shadow note, something darker beneath the yeast and spice. They cannot name it. They do not wish to. They eat, they enjoy. But somewhere deep in memory the legend stirs, whispering, what do you truly consume? Ghosts do not need bodies to linger. They live in fear, in rumour, in ritual. The barber's shop is gone, the baker's oven cold. No bones lie beneath the streets, at least none proven. Yet the ghost remains, woven into Seville's very stones. He walks beside tourists, hums behind locals, waits in doorways that may never have been his. His chair is empty, yet occupied. His razor is clean, yet bloodied. His oven is cold, yet burning. Seville pretends to laugh at the story, but it cannot shake it. For it speaks to something deeper than crime. It speaks to the city's own contradictions. Beauty masking corruption, faith shadowed by hunger, intimacy tainted by betrayal. The barber is not just a ghost of one shop, he is the ghost of Seville itself, a reflection of its darkest corners, its whispered secrets. And so he lingers, in the songs sung late at night, in the silence between bells, in the laughter of children playing games they do not understand, in the smell of bread drifting down alleys at dawn, in the glint of a razor caught by candlelight. The ghosts of the barber shop do not walk, they hum, they smoke, they gleam, and they wait, as they always have, for the next man to sit in the chair, the next mouth to open for a pie. The chair stands empty, the razor lies still, the oven is cold, yet the story breathes. For more than 2 centuries, Seville has carried the whisper of its demon barber. Whether he lived or not, whether his cellar truly held bones, whether the baker's pies were ever filled with flesh, the tale endures. It endures because it is more than history. It is hunger given voice, fear given flesh, betrayal given form. And so the question remains, was he real? Or was he only ever a shadow born of famine and rumour? Historians search the archives and find nothing. No trial, no execution, no official record. Seville kept meticulous notes of its criminals, its punishments, its articles of justice. The name of no barber, no baker appears in the lists of the condemned. The silence is deafening. Skeptics argue this proves the tale is invention, folklore imported from Paris or Florence, reshaped to fit Spanish streets. The Rue des Marmousets in Paris, after all, had its barber and baker centuries earlier. London would one day have its Sweeney Todd immortalised in theatre. Seville's barber may simply be their sibling, another mask worn by Europe's hunger-haunted imagination. And yet silence is not certainty. Absence of record does not mean absence of crime. Men vanished in Seville. This is fact. Sailors disappeared, beggars were swallowed by alleys, travellers left no trace. The poor and the nameless do not haunt archives, they haunt only memory. A barber's cellar may never have been opened, but bones lay hidden in many places in that city, uncounted, unnamed. And the pies? Who can say what meat filled ovens in times of famine, when hunger gnawed harder than law? Perhaps there was a barber, perhaps there was not, perhaps he killed many, perhaps none. Perhaps his story is stitched together from a dozen vanishings, from the smell of meat too rich, from the fears of a city rotting beneath its gilded surface. The truth is as elusive as smoke. What matters is not what happened, but what was believed. For the barber's legend reveals more about Seville than any document could. It tells of a city caught between wealth and ruin, faith and corruption, beauty and hunger. It tells of people who trusted their neighbours and feared them all the same. It tells of a society where the poor could vanish without consequence, where the powerful needed stories to warn against sin, where hunger made anything believable. The barber is not just a man. He is a mirror held up to the city, reflecting its darkest truths, and beyond Seville, he is Europe's ghost, the Rue des Marmousets, the Florentine butcher, Sweeney Todd. Each version carries the same bones, dressed in different flesh. Each warns of the same betrayal, the intimacy of the barber's blade, the sanctity of the baker's bread, corrupted and inverted. Each feeds the same primal fear, that trust can kill, that hunger can damn, that the ordinary can turn monstrous in the blink of an eye. This is why the barber will never die. Myths do not require bodies, they require belief. And belief, once born, sharpens itself with every retelling. Today, Seville still walks with him. Guides whisper his tale to tourists, locals laugh, deny, then glance uneasily at shuttered shops. Children still dare one another to hum the barber's song in the dark. The barber is gone, if he ever lived. But his chair still waits in imagination, his razor still gleams in candlelight, his oven still smokes in the mind's nose. He lives not in flesh, but in fear. And so we end where we began, a room no larger than a coffin, a candle burning low, a razor gleaming, catching the light. An empty chair polished by countless bodies waiting. Outside, footsteps approach. A hand reaches for the door. Would you sit? Would you trust the man holding the blade? The curtain falls, the story lingers, and in the silence that follows, the razor gleams one last time, on the razor's edge of truth.